Hi again, everybody. This is Diana Kowarski, and you are listening to the Soft Skills Salon podcast, the audio think tank where we hear from international and diverse voices, both novice and expert. We have a fantastic episode today, and our guest is Alan Middleton, and Alan has indulged me with going through our Soft Skills Salon questionnaire and has pre-selected several questions from that questionnaire that will form the foundation of our conversation. And the idea with this podcast is exactly that, how it is that the conversation is what we refer to as the currency of communication. So a conversation with Alan Middleton and some fantastic information about him for all of our listeners. He is an independent author and speaker and a consultant with Sage Management Advice. His 25-year practitioner career includes marketing roles with the Universal Oil Products Company in Chicago, USA, Esso Petroleum in Oslo, Norway, and a career in advertising with the J. Walter Thompson Advertising Agency in the UK, Canada, and Japan. And he also concluded as president and CEO of J. Walter Thompson Japan, an executive vice president and a board member of the worldwide company. An incredible career path. All of that happened before I even met Alan. I've had the privilege of knowing Alan for quite a while now, and we'll get into that probably in this podcast. In addition to being a well sought out voice in terms of his marketing expertise and his academic prowess and his real insights into how it is that business functions, he indeed served York University as the executive director of the Schulich Executive Education Center, otherwise known as SEEK, which ran and continues to run non-degree programs for over 10,000 executives and managers a year, both domestically and internationally. And Alan was in that role from 2001 until 2020. His career has continued and has taken a incredible number of twists and turns, and he is now sitting on not-for-profit boards, including CanadaHelps.org, is highly involved with AMA Toronto on the advisory board. And I'm just wondering when he has a chance to relax, because he's just always busy. Hello, my friend. Hello, Alan.
Who was that person you were talking about? I don't know him.
I could go on and on. I think that there's a lot, and I appreciate, I greatly truncated your bio, and with your indulgence, I appreciate you allowing me to do so, because there is...
You don't want your audience to fall asleep at this point.
No, not at all. It's an amazing career, and one in which I'm delighted to have had some witness and or some brief contribution to.
Thank you.
Alan, let's begin where we can focus on this idea of soft skills in our conversation. The first of the questions that you selected is one of my favorites, as it is quite timely, and it reads, how do you compare pre-COVID soft skills to what we're framing as moving beyond COVID soft skills at work? And if you can give me an alternate phrase to moving beyond COVID that is optimistic and still accurate, I'm more than open to that as well.
Yes, the adjustment era.
Exactly.
I guess my thoughts about the effect of COVID is it's both an acceleration and a change in management style. Let's go back pre-COVID, because there were trends to try to reduce hierarchies. There were trends to try to get more groups, indigenous groups and people of color involved and promoted. There were trends to try to listen more to people and not expect them to just follow orders. Mm-hmm. What I think has happened with COVID, and it's partly the online experience, but it's also partly how you keep people motivated and engaged, is I think organizations are finally recognizing that they're following an old industrial era model. That old industrial era model came through the Industrial Revolution when technology leapt forward, but the role of the junior manager or the employee was to do what somebody senior told them to do. Mm-hmm. Now we're in an era, the West particularly, but also some areas of the East, struggles with innovation. How do you gain innovation? You gain it by moving away from some of the industrial era developments. For instance, role specialization. Well, that has led to, and what I think COVID's beginning to break down, that one department doesn't talk to another department. Marketing doesn't know what sales is doing, doesn't know what accounting's doing, doesn't know what production's doing, and so on. And real innovation has to come from people working across those groups. Second area, it's not always the people on top who are the brightest and the best, and most importantly, not dealing with their customer or their organization on a day-to-day basis. It's people further down the hierarchy. So we should be, organizations are beginning to learn, we need to be listening to them and paying attention to them. And I'm going to use a very quick story from Japan, from a company called Ito Yokodo, which owns 7-Eleven.
Oh.
Even pre-COVID, they were realizing the Japanese love fresh food, especially fresh fish food and shrimp and things like that. But they're always late in picking up consumer trends. And this one woman in one of the stores found a way of, she communicated in the evening what her customers had been asking for during the day, and by a special informal deal, got the people collecting the fish at the market in the morning to deliver to the store to have it there.
Right.
Ito Yokodo was smart enough to recognize that and set up a system whereby all their frontline people in the fresh fish area would send in requests to say, this is what consumers are demanding. And if it wasn't a regular order from a regular supplier, the central purchasing people were given permission to make special new contracts in order to fill the order. This was 20, 25 years ago. They were doing this. So this is an example of some of the stuff that's happening if you listen to the front line and develop your system about it, which means your front line better be motivated, which brings in all the soft skills, but particularly that you not only listen, but you pay attention. So let's stop there for a second.
I love the fact that there's a two-pronged approach in what I'm hearing you say, Alan. And the first part around that idea that every voice at the virtual or at the literal table has a valid voice is implicit there. And perhaps what we have had previously to value or evaluate one voice as being tied to a certain level of compensation is not necessarily the correct way of evaluating that voice. So you're absolutely right. It's the voices that we're listening to and the legitimation that's offered to everybody.
No, it doesn't mean that you automatically do what every suggestion says, but it does mean you listen and explore it. Yeah, absolutely.
And I would tie it back to one of the core tenets of critical thinking is what are all of the available options so that I can distill and create a more comprehensive choice.
Absolutely.
The second piece that you mentioned in your example, I find really interesting, and that is the authority for that individual at either that front line or at a big air quote reference junior level to modify a relationship or to create within parameters a policy or a procedure that is responsive and innovative and perhaps even in the moment. I don't know if we're ready in North America.
It's difficult. Now her credibility was gained by her sales. So there was proof points of the effectiveness of her thing. So it wasn't just sales, it was their positioning versus competition, because fresh fish is very powerful as a consumer attractor in Japan. So they were doing better than competition. So this wasn't just listening to a whim. There were proof points and advantages for the organization behind it. So that was absolutely. But the other thing that extended to that is it went beyond her direct reporting level. It went from the sales into the purchasing. So it moved across silos is the other powerful thing about that. And that's where we are struggling still. I see evidence that we are getting better. That's why project management is still one of the most popular training things, because project management engages you in thinking across the boundaries, right, and especially as the boundaries are often too narrow. But the other thing,
go ahead.
No, the other thing that needs to go on, which is, it's been popular as a study in Europe and Asia, but not North America, which is complexity theory. What complexity theory drives us to do is, when we come up with a plan, to think about what might be the unintended consequences of the plan before you put it in place. Very quick story on that. I had a direct experience of that when I was moving my parents in the UK into a home from their house when they were really aging. And I went round, it was the area they lived in, which was famous for having retired people. And I found so many of the places I interviewed to help them were closing. And I'm going, this is the generation. The boomers are coming. Why are you closing? The British government had passed an act of parliament very sensibly to legislate the quality of care in extended care homes. Should there be an elevator, or if you're in England, a lift? There's more than one floor. Are there hold-on bars in the showers and baths, and that kind of stuff. And they put these very sensible regulations in, but they hadn't recognised that most extended care homes in the UK were owned by private citizens who only owned 2 or 3 houses, and the cost of doing this was too much, and there was no financing as part of it. So, in fact, until they changed the financing provisions, for 5 years, the number of extended care homes in the UK went down, not up, at a time when people are flowing in. It's because they weren't thinking that, again, complexity theory, what are the implications of your actions? And implications of actions can be much better understood by asking cross-functional teams who have responsibility for doing this and who are close to the front line, what's likely to go on. So the post-COVID world, this is beginning to happen. We're facing new problems, but I do see this happening. I see this happening with our big corporate institutions like the banks. They still have problems hiring within the call centers and within the branches. There's still a tendency for organizations. Canada undertrains its people. It doesn't upgrade the skills of its people. The last survey I saw from IMD in Europe, we're number 28 in the world on the money and time our corporations spend on training. But it's not just training in the job, it's training in the role of the job within the organization with the client. So you don't just want to train people about how you deposit in a bank.
Yes.
But about what the bank can do for that customer and how to follow up. And the same in a whole bunch of other areas. So that's the other thing I think is going to accelerate in the post-COVID world. And it's more complex. And I'm going to make a rude comment, and I'll stand by it, which is the HR role has been an amateur role for a long time, despite its attempts to be taken seriously. The HR is now, done properly, a critical, central planning, strategic, and executional role in the organization, not an afterthought just to keep your employees and managers happy.
So there's a whole bunch to unpack in that answer, and I'll hit on HR last. And I can't say that I disagree with you, but let's unpack a few other points first. One of my conversations of late is being echoed in some of your comments about the relationship and perhaps even tension between a generalized approach versus a specialized approach. And I can tell you many years ago in my own career path, having received critical feedback about being too much of a generalist and not enough of a specialist. And is it fair to say that my understanding of your answer is that relationship is going to evolve or is evolving now?
And the example I'm going to use, and a number of schools are doing this, is engineers used to focus not only on engineering, but whether it was electrical engineering or chemical engineering.
Yes.
And it was so specific, but they never were trained in management skills. They were never trained in links across the board. And finally, engineering schools are recognizing that. The other example I'm going to use are medical schools, which still struggle to get a better balance of gender and background in there, but still have appallingly bad relationships with nursing staff and other incredibly important support staff.
Yes.
So the management skill in medicine becomes a more important role. So if that is generalization, so it's out of the specialization. Now,
yes.
It doesn't mean you stop focusing on the specialization because you want the deep knowledge, but it's got to be in a context of what's needed for the organization and what's needed for the patients, clients, customers, whoever it is, of the organization.
I love that word context, and it's one that I've been using quite frequently lately. And I honestly believe that it is one of the real benefits, and there are very, very few, real benefit of the thinking or the renewed appreciation for some of the thinking that COVID has brought to some of our collective conscience and consciousness. So that context of a specialist on a medical team in partnership with the internist, with the nurse, with the ward manager, with the, et cetera, et cetera. You're absolutely right that the idea of those generalist skills don't diminish the specialized knowledge. If anything, it does mean that we have better outcomes, that the outcomes are more observable. Perhaps I would even argue measurable, because
they are. We know recovery rates of patients who've gone through operations improve the more the patient understands what's happening to them, and that they can relate to the staff around them in getting answers and explanations.
Right.
This is going to be, technology is driving this as well, and because the acceleration of use of technology through COVID is driving this even more. So, for instance, I'm still involved with Sunnybrook Health Sciences. And one of the priorities for Sunnybrook amongst most leading-edge health institutions is at-home treatment. We no longer want to automatically bring people in, except when they need urgent operations, into a hospital. So how are we going to do that? And British Columbia has been a lead in this because their healthcare system has been supplying distance treatment for Aboriginal groups in the north and other people for a long time. In that environment, you don't trust the technology, you trust the people you're addressing and accessing through the technology. So the need to have that patient orientation, that cross specialization orientation, even more important. And that equivalence in other things as well, because the COVID revolution has pushed us more and more to doing stuff from home, to doing stuff independently. And if we're too independent, the risk becomes we lose the very integration that can lead to innovation and good teamwork. So that's the challenge.
Absolutely. And touching upon, I have several clients in healthcare, and I can tell you that chairside manner in a variety of different ways, coupled with the innovation around AI and artificial intelligence, says that we are actually going to probably need fewer of X kind of specialist in the foreseeable future, because we are developing tech to read the chart. I'm not suggesting it's absolute, but it's on the horizon, and people much smarter than I am are thinking about this right now. And then there's the, communicating of what that AI is saying. And that's exactly what this, as you phrased it, this COVID revolution is shining a brighter spotlight on. The last piece I'll say to you, Alan, around this is your comments around human resources. And I can tell you that throughout my career, I've had a precarious relationship with resources. It's complicated. There's a human part to the human resources that I like to acknowledge. It is much more complex and always has, COVID notwithstanding, than I honestly believe that we have given it credit. However, historically, there has been a lovely and perhaps even seductive feel-good approach that has attracted many well-intentioned and under-sophisticated people to that field.
It's true.
And I know you and I have had conversations about this in the past when we've worked together more directly. And part of that transition that you mentioned earlier about everyone's voice being valid, HR really thought it had a valid voice, yet there wasn't any metrics that supported it until COVID. And now we have metrics for HR. Does that resonate with you?
Yep, it does, very much so. And it's helping shape some leadership comments. One of my favorite people in banking is a guy called John Doig, who's, I think his current role is head of consumer banking at Scotiabank. And he once said to me in an interview, when I pressed him about why Canadians don't like their banks, according to most reputation surveys.
Right.
And he said, yes, Alan, that's right. But what we want to do is to get people to like their bankers more. And in that, and that's why, in particularly through COVID and since COVID, I know all 5 of the major banks and Desjardins and some of the others are putting much more time and effort for senior managers to talk to people in the branches or at the call centers and make connection and learn what's going on and make them more important. Have they gone far enough? Not yet, but I do see shifts in that direction.
Amazing. And again, just looking at how it is the connection, and that connection is the people.
Absolutely.
And if that connection is a person with expert insight into the customer because they are customer facing, then they deserve the ear of that person who might be several layers away. And if I am that customer, I need to buy what you're selling, right? I need to.
Absolutely. Well, especially in this day and age where we unfortunately live in a world because of the technological revolution and social media. Where do you go for trusted information? We're all battling. What do I believe? Because so much that comes out of the mouths of social media is absolute, excuse the language, BS. I won't use the full phrase. So who do you want to trust? So part of your engagement with an organization and with an individual is the trust I build in that individual. And that individual can only deliver that trust if they're trusted by the management. Again, this doesn't mean that the senior management does everything junior management or employees tell them to do.
Right.
It does mean they need to listen and demonstrate they've listened and thought it through.
And that as a result, either by hook or crook, that means that they are indeed more informed than they would be elsewise.
Absolutely. Right? Absolutely. Yep.
This next question that you selected, I admit with full disclosure, I was tickled when I saw it because I actually have a story about this, and I know you've answered similar questions in the past. So this next question is, what does success leading others look like to you? And Alan, I remember many years ago when I had my first opportunity to work and travel to Iqaluit. And I found myself in February alone in Iqaluit, lovely group, lovely people, but remarkably homesick as I was there and my family were not there with me. And in the one hotel at that time that was in Iqaluit, making my way out when it was minus a trillion gajillion degrees, going through the hotel lobby, I heard your voice. And you were being interviewed by the CBC. You were on television. And I was so delighted that you had followed me to Iqaluit. And I had never had a chance to tell you that it was a lovely trip with you. So thank you.
I only did it because I knew you'd listen to it.
It was such a spark in a very chilly and important trip in my career. But I remember the joy. I know that voice. I know what? It's Alan. And indeed, you were speaking about the theme that we are now going to talk about, and that's this, how is it that you've been successful in leading others, or what are your thoughts on that?
Firstly, I'm not sure I have, but. A quick side note on the Okalowitz story.
Oh, yeah.
National Geo this month has a big piece on the importance of touch to human beings in a lot of studies and everything else. Communication is touch. Now, the article on National Geo focuses on a physical touch, and that's important.
Right.
Communication is part of touch. It's not just getting across ideas. It's recognizing the other and who you're talking to. So go back to your question. I would suggest that most people you interviewed about me before the 1990s would not have had me as a very successful leader. I was a bit bloody arrogant. The British accent helps, but even in the UK, where I'd worked for a number of years, and, I was pushing too hard. Working class lad in the UK, so I always had to prove myself. Taking over as president, JWT Japan taught me so much. Not only because I was one of only 5 or 6 foreigners in a staff of about 1,000 Japanese, but because I learned things. I was coming out of my first management meeting. The management group was about 12, 13 people. And the old wise guy was our head of our media department, Maida-san. And in this first meeting, Japanese meetings last a long time because you explore different things. That's the other thing I learned. You went in with an agenda, but then different people explored different parts of the agenda. And I came out of the meeting, and it lasted 3 hours. And I said to my head of HR, head of personnel, as they called them then, I said, how did it go? Oh, very good, Alan said, very good. But what about Maida-san? He didn't say anything. And he looked at me puzzled and put his head to one side, which is where I always knew I'd asked a stupid question to my Japanese people. He said, but Alan-san, he was there. And that was the important thing. If there'd been something he wanted to express, he would have said it. But the fact he was there, he wasn't sleeping, he was listening. He'd been head of the union of the organization beforehand. So as I gradually got to try to understand my Japanese, and my Japanese was pathetic even though I was taking lessons, I got to understand more and more the importance of people. In a seemingly more stratified environment, I recognized that what was going on was a lot more importance given to how the people responded. And particularly women, because at that time, women managers in Japanese society were not well developed. We used to get the brightest women because as a foreign marketing company, they'd come and work for us because we wouldn't just have them making tea. And life changed a bit since then. But it was Japan that taught me a lot about listening and recognizing difference in people. Up to that point, I'd been expecting anybody who worked for me to be brilliant at everything. And I hadn't helped form them as teams. I hadn't listened to their ideas enough. And Japan taught me that. And when I came back and started running Seek and started doing other things, it became much more important to me to understand and listen to what people were really saying and explore it. Look what was going on. Make a decision, yes, but explain why you've made that decision. I heard you. Here's what I heard you say. Did I get that right? Listen, let's not ignore it, but here's some reasons why we can't do it right now. But that idea that you had, so pick up on the ideas. And great managers, and one of your later questions was, who should you talk to? I mentioned John Doig before. John, to me, is a great guy. He's done superbly well at Scotiabank and is the world's nicest human being, and he listens. Ed Clark, who used to run the TD, has the same. So we had these people who had that touch, and they were the ones I admired. And as I read up academically about it, the other ones I admired were those who had less problems when they left the company. In other words, they had a succession plan. In other words, they got into the organization enough to understand how succession planning works. And then the third area, to me, of great leadership is not just succession planning, but succession planning and equipping people for changes for the future. You know, one of the traps, when I was in advertising, my client I had in the UK, Canada, and Japan was Kodak.
Oh.
Well, whatever happened to Kodak? Kodak, sadly, was an example that was so far ahead in where it was, but didn't listen or watch to the way things were progressing.
Right.
And kept putting people in senior positions to reinforce what they were good at, but not to guide them to where life was going. So the third element of skill in leadership to me is, number one is listening to the people. Number two is developing mobility systems so that people move across different departments and can move up fairly easily. But the third thing is that are not threatened by looking at areas of change for the organization, because that's the development for the future that's needed.
Three very important ways of understanding this. Let me be a bit of a exploration provocateur, if I may. How does one develop succession planning or mobility systems in a unionized environment?
Yep. Firstly, by not assuming that everybody in the union is stupid or not worth it.
Absolutely.
Engage them.
Absolutely.
I sat on a board with, I'll keep his name quiet so as not to embarrass him, but he was head of the Construction Workers Union of Canada at a point in time, and I sat on a board with him. And I was really impressed with this guy because he'd recognized with construction workers, we're not going to get employers to give full-time jobs. But what I can do is focus on three things that are really important to construction workers. Number one, that they have all the health and safety on site that they require so their lives aren't threatened. And negotiate that with employers. Number two, that they had opportunities to improve their skills. So if they came on as unskilled, were there opportunities through the union or through employers to upgrade their skills so that they could improve their earnings by becoming more skilled? And then the third element was, how do you help people, if you like, look out after their careers, look after their jobs, providing advice for how they operate as human beings in this world and get recognized for it. And those three areas, he put in a series of programs in those areas. And what started developing, of course, was leadership. Mm-hmm. Because as the union progressed the skills, you could see, and I met a number of them, actually coming up, thinking about the different issues in construction. The smarter construction companies paid for some of these people to go into more supervisory roles and new styles of construction as well. So it was a way of getting to the top. So
there are ways of doing it, in other words, right? There are
always ways of doing it.
Yeah,
and the other way is listening to them. Don't forget, the German system still has the fact that unions are represented on the boards of most German companies.
Yes,
and they've managed to have employee unions represented, as well as shareholders, as well as management represented, and found ways to work together in a number of areas very successfully.
Absolutely.
In government, more of an issue. Because essentially it's called government essential skills. Yes, there's over bureaucracy, but a lot of it's essential skills. And trying to develop, I think what would help is develop measures of success and achievement, not just experience in the job. Unions have had to go to years of experience as a default position for a lot of salary and everything else. And everybody knows, even the most vehement unionists know, that 20 years of an out-of-date skill is not valid. 20 years using that skill to look at new ways of doing things and to have a say in it is. And that's the transition that needs to happen, particularly in government.
Let's hope that that's one of those pieces that this COVID era will put under some sort of scrutiny. I'm thinking in particular around some of our teachers and how there's
absolutely
a lot on the table there around what those responsibilities of that next generation of workers and thinkers are being exposed to. And if the only
and it's why one of the things I admire about Germany is they've probably got one of the best apprenticeship systems in the world, because they not only train people in the craft or the technology of the job, but a broader take on management, a broader take on their education, so that they're not regarded as just doers. They're seen as contributing thinkers. And that's the big difference.
Absolutely. And the measurement of success being more than time in.
Exactly.
Is a very different mindset to bring to this. And your point about looking out for others' careers as a part to differentiate, potentially to build a succession plan, is a lovely segue to our third and final question around what have you seen or done on the job to develop a person's professional presence? What comes to mind?
As far as possible, and you'll probably get inundated with phone calls saying, Alan didn't do that. I tried as much as possible to always have training there as part of the development. Training in a way that you see what promise there is in a person, but also what they think as well. So some conversation about what skills do you think should be developed further. Now, as a supervisor, a direct manager, when I ran Schuler's education system, I tried to keep the levels tight. So hopefully there were no more than 3 levels. So I had good connection. It was a small group, about 75 people at the biggest. So it was easier. But recognizing that all skills can be upgraded at every level and needed to be upgraded at every level. IBM, and I'll say something nice about IBM, it's had its ups and downs, but IBM has, and in fact, in my book on mentorship, I did a great interview with a lady called Sophie Stanton from IBM Middle East. And she reminded me how good IBM has been getting their people to take training programs. And in fact, they used to insist that you would take at least 4 weeks with some kind of upgrade of your skills. IBM also used to it was a nickname by some of its employees, I've been moved. And it was because IBM saw value in moving people around different responsibilities to add to their overall capability. And they've always been good at that. There are some others. I'm hearing that kind of positive from Shopify, that they're looking to have their people move around and also upgrade skills. So what I look for in leadership is your responsibility is not just to finally sign off on the direction, the strategic role, the resources, and everything else. But to quote one ex-client of my personal client who ran a wonderful organization called the Escalator Handrail Company, so you never guess what business they were in. and he was fabulous. He owned the company. He had a career in working in that industry. And I said, why have you been so successful? He said, because I recognize smart people. I give them the opportunity to use their smarts, and I make success out of it.
Makes a lot of sense to me. I'm also reminded, pre-COVID, mind you, of some work that I've done with Samsung. Yep. And I know that you've certainly done some work with Samsung. And pre-COVID, they had such a commitment to temporarily, but still to relocating, around the globe, relocating staff and families so that there could be more of a holistic understanding
Yep.
of the
Yep.
organization.
Yep.
And I thought that was just such an investment in a
Absolutely.
whole person approach. And it certainly isn't necessarily an easy one to relocate one's
Absolutely.
partner and children and to
Yep.
find them a place to, call home again.
Yep.
However, the implication in terms of professional or executive presence
Yeah.
was a perspective that was inaccessible, certainly pre-COVID, when we weren't necessarily as comfortable, even a high-tech company like Samsung, in relying on virtual platforms.
Absolutely.
And if you weren't in the room with that perspective, then we just didn't have that perspective as part of the decision making.
Yep.
So I think that also can help. And
absolutely,
that idea of developing other people's potentials that can indeed bring more value to your own impact and the presence that you
and recognizing people get there in different ways. And
right.
You mentioned global, but I'll use a diverse population that we have in Canada as an example. Yeah. One of the activities I've stayed involved with is mentoring people in marketing. And I seem to have had a large number of mentees who have been immigrants. Mm-hmm. And you recognize how important it is to understand the challenges in culture it takes when you're moving into either a new country or a new company or a new organization. And I'm talking Indigenous groups as well, who are finding problems, what's happening in this dominant culture. So part of that is to try to look at things and have them talk to you about how it works from their point of view. And I'll use an example of a mentee I had last year who'd immigrated from Morocco. And he arrived in March 2020. Poor guy, what a time to arrive. Just in time for everything to close down for the COVID. And after 3 or 4 sessions online, he said, can I ask you a non-business question? I was trying to help him get a job and everything else. Mm-hmm. He said, do all Canadians lie? Oh. And I said, explain what you mean. He said, well, in Morocco, we're fairly blunt with each other. If there isn't a job, somebody will say, there isn't a job, but might be worth checking back in 6 months' time. But in the meantime, talk to so-and-so and so-and-so. In Canada, people say, well, I'm not sure. I don't think there's anything at the moment. They'll duck around. They'll never tell you. So then I'll ask, well, what do I need to get a job? Well, and he would never get a straight answer. So, and I recognize that immigrating from the UK to Canada was not a difficult immigration. Yes, there are cultural value differences when I came, but they're not that significant. Mm-hmm. But you think about the diversity of Toronto, with a 52% of people not born in Canada. Right. Part of leadership is recognizing how you bring that on so that people are more comfortable in their role, and how to learn the culture, because yes, they've got to learn the dominant culture, but how you also build in some of the things that they bring from their culture. One of the joys I had, although he's in trouble at the moment, I had in my class when I was teaching at Schulich, the first a person from the Toronto Police Force Management Group doing his MBA. He was Jamaican, black Jamaican, and he had done well in the police force, but was facing a number of issues. And what helped him was understanding management in a broader context much more. So that understanding, recognition of difference, accelerating it where it develops you, helped you with the innovation, but help them understand a sharing dominant culture. That's what leadership is.
And indeed, the full circle in terms of this COVID revolution brings us back to some of your original comments about the importance of how to keep people motivated and how to have people included in terms of there being a broader spectrum of information available to make better choices, better leadership, and to have a bigger presence. Absolutely. As we are wrapping up our time, I want to give a complete shout out and hopefully enormous push to your latest book, which is Mentorship Matters Now More Than Ever, which is published by the American Marketing Association, the Toronto chapter, I believe, as a part of its mentorship activities, and of course available on Amazon. And hopefully folks will indeed check that out. Alan, it has been a pleasure to have worked with you for many, many years, and it's been equally a pleasure to spend this time with you on this podcast. And I look forward to knowing you for a lot longer.
What you're doing is really important, because the more we can educate people and get them sensitized to this, the better everybody will be.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time again, Alan. A pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to another dynamic and informative episode of the Soft Skills Salon with your host, Diana Kowarski. Please consider subscribing to our show wherever you listen to your podcasts. And we also encourage you to visit our website and social media links, which you can find in the show's notes. We look forward to bringing you another episode. And remember, conversation is the currency of communication. Bye for now.